it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, David Shih. He is the president of the ACLU of Wisconsin, the Chippewa Valley chapter, and also member of the state board of the ACLU Wisconsin. And he's a professor of English at the University of Eau Claire. So I'm proud to and happy, grateful to introduce David.
Thanks, Lynn. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you tonight. Thank you very much to Jonah for having me here to talk to you. I'm going to try to share my screen now, and hopefully it'll come through okay. How does that look? Can you see a slide on your screen? If you would just nod, great. Okay. So there'll also be a little bit of interaction with this presentation, and I'm hoping that you can use the raise hand function at one point or even the chat function at another, and it'll be at the very beginning, and then the rest of the presentation will be me talking about my subject, which is Asian American is not a culture. This is an image from 1983, and it's a march for justice for a man named Vincent Chin, who I will be talking about at the beginning of the presentation. We don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this. This is just an intro about me in case some of you don't know who I am, but I'll leave this here for a second and move on to the first part of the presentation, which is a question for you about the term Asian American. And I'm curious, maybe you can use the raise hand function for this. How many of you actually say the words Asian American regularly in conversation, just to say once a week, where it's a term that is part of your vernacular? I'm looking at my
You might have to tell people how to raise their hand.
Okay. You can do it. I think you have to get that little menu to drop down from
hit the participants where the number is, and then it will bring a list and offer you the option on the bottom right of that panel.
Thank you. So maybe you can just leave that hand up throughout the rest of the presentation. This part asks you to type something in chat, and once again from that drop-down menu you can click on the chat button. It looks like 3 participants have raised a hand. I should say that that's not uncommon. I ask my students every semester the same question, and they don't. And I think there are consequences for not using that term, not being aware of its history, and it's something that I wanted to talk about this evening. So if you don't use the term Asian American, could you tell me which terms you do use in its place when you're referring to Asians in the US? And you can type this in to the chat. I see Hmong, I see very specific terms like Korean American and Chinese American. A couple of you say Asian. One person says that they're Hmong, so they use that term and tend to refer to other Asians by their ethnicity. Another person has said Vietnamese. Thank you very much. Again, this is very much in line with what my students tell me. The first thing I want to do is to talk to you about race and ethnicity. I think these concepts can be confusing to people who aren't very specific about them or aren't aware of their uses in society. What I'm showing you now is an essay that I have my students read, and it's an oldie but goodie comes from the early 90s. It's written by a law professor, Harlan Dalton, in an essay entitled Failing to See. And I'm just going to focus in on this one part for you, where Dalton says that, of course, ethnic groups influence one another in myriad ways, and more than occasionally come into conflict, but they do not need each other to exist. In contrast, races exist only in relation to one another. I think it's a very fundamental difference between race and ethnicity. We often hear those two words used in conjunction, sometimes even anonymously, but I'm here tonight to tell you that we shouldn't do that, and that we should understand the difference between the two. One way I explain it is to say that, well, I'm Chinese, for instance, that's my ethnicity, and if every Chinese person in the world disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, Irish people would still know what it meant to be Irish. That is, it wouldn't change the language that Irish people spoke, their kinship traditions, their religion. Ethnicities can exist independently of one another. If every Black person disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, what it meant to be white would be very different. So I'm going to leave you with that thought as a way to tell the difference between these two concepts. When I ask my students, what does it mean to be Chinese American? And I have very few Chinese American students. They will point to things like this image on the right. They'll point to festivals and holidays and traditions. They might talk about food. They would talk about language. They would talk about all of these components of identity that have to do with ethnicity. They talk about all of these components of identity that have to do with culture. There's another way to answer this question of what does it mean to be Chinese American, however. One way to answer that question is that you are more vulnerable to hate crimes. One might be you eat a lot of rice with your meals. Another is that you could be confused for another Asian ethnicity and be killed for it. That's the difference between race and ethnicity. There are different ways that you can be Chinese American. Too often, the way that we talk about Asian American identity is through the lens of culture. And here I'm asking us to think about Asian American identity in terms of race, which is the only way to think about it. These two men are named Ronald Ebens and Michael Neitz. And I don't imagine that very many of you know who these men are. Some of you might. Ronald Ebens was a foreman at Chrysler Corporation in Highland Park, Michigan. In 1982, Ronald Ebens and Michael Neitz, who's his stepson, were at a bar in Highland Park. And there they met a Chinese American man named Vincent Chin. And Vincent was there celebrating his bachelor party. He was going to be married in a week. The three of them got into an argument. Mostly it was between Ronald Ebens and Vincent Chin. And according to witnesses, this is what Ronald Ebens said to Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin wasn't going to be insulted like that, and the three men got into a fight. They brawled in the bar. After they got kicked out of the bar for fighting, they went to the parking lot, at which time Michael Neitz took a Louisville Slugger bat out of the trunk of his car and approached Vincent Chin with it. Chin and his friends ran away. Ronald Ebens and Michael Neitz got back into the car. They actually hired an accomplice, paying him $20 to help him find this Chinese guy, they said. They finally found Vincent Chin and his friend sitting outside of the McDonald's. And while Michael Neitz held Vincent Chin, Ronald Ebens took the bat and struck him in the head, in the knees, and in the ribs, beating him so brutally that witnesses claimed that they saw brains on the pavement. Vincent Chin died days later. Some of the eyewitnesses were off-duty police officers, and Vincent Chin's last words were, "It isn't fair." Judge Charles Kaufman is a Wayne County judge, and he sentenced Ebens and Neitz to 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine each on a plea bargain charge of manslaughter. What he said was, you don't make the punishment fit the crime, you make the punishment fit the criminal. This became a very sensationalized case, not only in the Detroit area, but it became very quickly a national story. And what you had was a group of people, mostly Asian Americans, who created an organization called American Citizens for Justice. And outraged by Judge Kaufman's sentence, they decided that they were going to try to pursue federal charges against Ebens and Neitz for violating the civil rights of Vincent Chin because of his race. Their case in federal court, as you know, when you bring somebody up on hate crime charges, depended on whether the person had racist intent when committing a crime. And so what mattered was whether a jury could decide whether it's because of you little MF that we're out of work is a racist statement. That's what the case depended on. The woman you see at the podium here is Lily Chin, Vincent's mother, who became the face of the movement for justice for him. Behind her, you might recognize Jesse Jackson. Frank Wu, who's a legal scholar, is quoted as saying, before the Vincent Chin case, it's fair to say that there weren't Asian Americans. What he meant was that Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipinos, Korean Americans didn't see themselves as a coherent group before. But when they saw what happened to Vincent Chin, they saw themselves as having the same vulnerabilities as he did. I think it's fair to say that Vincent Chin and the movement for justice for him invented the Asian American. Now this was really something, because in the past you had Asian ethnicities really wanting to distinguish themselves from one another. They didn't see themselves as being part of a coherent group. What you see here is a photograph from Life magazine in December 1941, and you have a White House reporter here. I think this man's name is Joe Chang. And Joe has actually created a little handmade sign for himself that says Chinese reporter, not Japanese, please. And he's pinned it to his lapel. And you know as well as I do, that sign is basically saying, please don't commit a hate crime on me after Pearl Harbor. Ebens was convicted in federal court, but there was some kind of mishandling of evidence, so he got another trial. The original trial was near Detroit, and the second trial was moved to what was called a neutral site, Cincinnati. They felt that Ebens wasn't going to get a fair trial in a city where it was clear that there was a lot of anti-Japanese bias because of the auto industry and the trouble it was having competing with Japanese imports. In Cincinnati, Ebens was acquitted of all federal charges, hate crime charges, and served no prison time. You should remember Ronald Ebens because he's the person American. This was really something in 84. This was because civil rights laws, these federal laws, civil rights laws, were thought to protect only African Americans. Some legal scholars even saw Asian Americans or Asian people as white. So what the Vincent Chin case did was open up these civil rights laws to apply to groups other than African Americans. So being Asian American means having something in common with other Asian Americans. This poster you see in front of you is from 1968. Some of you may be familiar with this slogan. It was very popular in Berkeley, and it showed a kind of racial solidarity between Asian Americans and Black Americans that became fairly scarce after that time. So Asian American is not a culture or ethnicity. What makes you Asian or Asian American is not what is inside of your body, not your genes, but what is outside of it. What is happening in society. People become Asian and stop becoming Asian all the time, depending on politics, history, what's going on the other side of the world. Sometimes I joke around with my students. I tell them, this was before the current administration, but I would say, hey, in 20 years, I'll be white. And some of them know what I'm talking about, but not many. And what I'm saying is, as far as the privileges that I have in this society, Asian Americans like me, East Asian Americans, are definitely trending in that direction. And all you have to do is look at metrics of education, income, intermarriage to see that happening. What it means to be Asian American is to have a shared vulnerability to the same kind of oppression. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that you have the same culture. It means that somebody can tell you, go back to where you came from, and then you become the victim of a hate crime after that. Asian American is a social identity. It's a racial identity. Remember what Professor Dalton said. Races exist only in relation to one another. This is from 1966. This is an issue of US News and World Report. And if you've ever heard the term model minority before, it was really born in the 60s when Black Americans were fighting for their civil rights. And suddenly, publications like US News and World Report wanted to pay attention to other racial minorities in the country. Just look at a couple of sentences from this story. At a time when Americans are awash in worry over the plight of racial minorities, and then at the bottom, still being taught in Chinatown is the old idea that people should depend on their own efforts, not a welfare check, in order to reach America's promised land. So the model minority stereotype wasn't invented ever to praise Asian Americans. It was invented to shame Black Americans. Races exist only in relation to one another. What this means is that as a racial identity, the meaning of Asian American is always changing. Some of these signs that you see here may be familiar to you. These Asian Americans maintain that they are still being discriminated against by schools like Harvard and Yale. They use the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to say that they're being discriminated against. What they don't understand is that they're using the same civil rights legislation that Black Americans fought for. And their fight to get into Harvard and Yale hurts Black Americans and Latinx people. So there's a lot of confusion about what it means to be Asian Americans. Pay attention these days to the ways that, for instance, the current administration is talking about Asian Americans who want to get into Harvard and Yale. They are saying that Asian Americans and white applicants are being discriminated against. When I told you that, I mentioned to my students that in 20 years I would be white. You can look at discourse like that Asian Americans and white Americans are being discriminated against by elite schools as evidence of that movement toward whiteness for East Asian Americans like myself. So I want to finish here just by talking about current Asian American and political Pacific Islander political issues. And I don't have a whole lot of time to go over these with you, but hopefully you can talk about some of them in your breakout sessions. So one issue is AAPI unemployment. I think it surprises a lot of people that the unemployment rate for Asian Americans is quite high. If you look back in January, Asian Americans are the red line here. I think it was at about 2.8% back in January. But look where it was in August. It was higher than every group with the exception of Black Americans. It was at 10.7%. And there are lots of reasons for this. Many Asian Americans are concentrated in the service industries, which were hit hard by the pandemic. There's also the model minority stereotype at work again, this feeling that Asian Americans don't need help from the government. They don't need that welfare check. They're good on their own. And also, there's the stereotype of being carriers of disease, the so-called China virus, that makes many people reluctant to patronize Chinese American businesses or Asian American businesses for that matter. The Filipino community is hit especially hard by COVID, especially in the health professional field. Another issue that you should know about and probably do already are anti-Asian hate crimes as a result of the pandemic. Research has shown that there was a steady decline in the association of Asian Americans with foreignness between the years of 2007 and 2020 until the China virus. And that's when the association between foreignness and Asian Americanness skyrocketed. Between March and August, you had over 2,500 recorded incidents of hate crimes against Asian Americans. And 1/4 of young Asian American students have said that they have been the victim of anti-Asian hate. This is a story from just 4 days ago, almost the reverse of the Vincent Chin story, where you had a Chinese person mistaken for being Japanese. Now you have a Japanese person being mistaken for Chinese. Remember, there is nothing essential or natural or genetic about these identities of Japanese American and Chinese American. Their meaning changes depending upon political circumstances. The House has passed an anti-Asian hate crime measure, but 164 members of Congress, Republicans, did not vote for it. It was a non-binding resolution. All it did was condemn anti-Asian sentiment during the pandemic. And the reasons that those lawmakers gave was that they saw it as an attack on the president, and they didn't believe that saying that the virus was Chinese was racist. Think about Ronald Ebens again and what he said to Vincent Chin and how hard it is to convince your fellow citizens that a phrase or a term like China virus is racist. An issue that hits close to home is the deportation of Southeast Asian Americans. These are stories from early this year. I'm sure a number of you participated in rallies in support of the Hmong community. And the ACLU has thrown its support behind the New Way Forward Act. I think a lot of you know about the so-called tough on crime bills from the Clinton administration, but much of the anti-immigration legislation that supports ongoing deportation was also a product of the Clinton administration from 1996. And so I would just Google the New Way Forward Act if you want to learn more about this particular issue. Another AAPI issue is family reunification. And Congresswoman Judy Chu has introduced the Reuniting Families Act that is basically about reuniting families who are caught in a visa backlog. Families that have been separated for years. Creating this presentation, I learned that it can take up to 25 years for a sibling to be reunited with a family member in the United States, and you have 4 million people waiting for that kind of visa. Lastly, we have the Supreme Court decision on DACA, still a very tenuous situation for undocumented Asian Americans. You've probably been following the revocation of temporary protected status for a lot of people in the United States, and that does include some Asian Americans. Most of them are from Nepal. And then you also have 85,000 H-1B visa holders affected by this new action from the Trump administration. H-1B visas largely given to immigrants from India and China. So these are all very important issues to the AAPI community. These are some organizations that you can turn to if you want to learn more about current issues affecting the AAPI community. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and 18 Million Rising. You can go to any of their web pages and find out what they're doing to fight for the civil rights of Asian Americans, which, as I hope I've demonstrated, is connected to and inseparable from the civil rights of all people in this country. So, Lynn, I think that that the timing was pretty good on this. So I'm not sure if there are time for questions or if you have to move on, but I do have to move on to my next meeting with my own civil rights organization, the ACLU of Wisconsin Chippewa Valley chapter.
Well, David, if you could put your contact information in the chat box so people could send questions, or if you have questions,
great idea.
Put them in the chat box and I can email them off to David as well later. And we can maybe talk about them at the end of the meeting if there's anything that works out. Well, thank you.
I have one quick question if possible. His internet was cutting out when he said what the man's last words were when he was saying, Mr. Chins. Your internet went out and I didn't catch some last words and I'm dying. I want to know what were his last words.
His last words were, "It isn't fair. It isn't fair."